At 70 years old, Charles Blackwell thought his life was over. 5 years of grief, 5 years of silence, 5 years of waiting for death to finally reunite him with Eleanor. But a single week in Portugal would change everything. A chance encounter with a woman named Constance Palmer would teach him that the heart never truly ages, that love is not reserved for the young, and that sometimes, when you least expect it, life offers you a second chance at happiness. This is the story of how two people discovered that falling in love at 70 is not just possible, it's the most beautiful thing that can happen to you. The morning light filtered through the windows of Charles Blackwell's house in Surrey, with the particular quality that comes in late September, when summer has definitively surrendered to autumn, but the transition has not yet become complete. He sat in the study where he had spent most of his mornings for the past 5 years, a room that still contained the accumulated evidence of a life that had been shared with another person. On the mahogany desk lay a cup of tea that had grown cold approximately 2 hours earlier. He had not drunk it. He had simply allowed it to sit there, a small monument to his own inability to engage with the basic rituals of living that had once seemed automatic and unremarkable. Charles Blackwell was 70 years old. He had been a respected surgeon for 43 years, had spent his professional life in operating theaters, where precision and clarity of thought were not merely desirable, but essential to the survival of the people whose bodies he had been entrusted to repair. He had been successful in his career in the way that men of his generation understood success. He had built a reputation, had earned a comfortable income, had achieved a level of professional recognition that had allowed him to feel that his life had been meaningful and purposeful. But that was before. That was before Eleanor had died. Eleanor had been his wife for 47 years. They had married when they were both 23 years old, had built a life together that had seemed, for the most part, to be a successful partnership. They had raised 3 children, all of them now doctors, all of them successful in their own right. 2 of them were twins, a boy and a girl, who had followed their father into medicine and had built practices of their own. The third was their youngest, a daughter who had become a pediatrician and who had married and had children of her own. Eleanor had been a teacher, had spent her career working with children in primary schools, had been the kind of person who seemed to derive genuine joy from the simple act of helping young people learn to read and to think and to engage with the world in meaningful ways. They had been happy, Charles and Eleanor, or at least they had been content. They had settled into the particular rhythm of a long marriage, had developed the kind of shorthand communication that comes from decades of shared experience. They had not been the kind of couple who expressed their affection through grand gestures or dramatic declarations. Their love had been quiet and steady, and had expressed itself primarily through the simple act of showing up, day after day, year after year, through the accumulation of small kindnesses and the willingness to remain present with each other through the inevitable difficulties that came with the passage of time. But then Eleanor had contracted COVID-19 in the spring of 2019. In those early days of the pandemic, when the virus was still new and poorly understood, and when the medical community was still struggling to understand how to treat it effectively. She had been 74 years old at the time, had been in generally good health, had seemed to be the kind of person who would recover without significant difficulty. But the virus had other plans. She had deteriorated rapidly, had spent 2 weeks in a hospital bed, had died on a Tuesday afternoon in April while Charles sat beside her, holding her hand, unable to do anything except bear witness to the fact that the person he had built his entire adult life around was leaving him. The grief that had followed had been unlike anything Charles had experienced before. It was not the kind of grief that one could simply endure and eventually move past. It was the kind of grief that had fundamentally altered the structure of his consciousness, that had made it clear that the life he had been living was no longer available to him, that he would have to construct an entirely new way of being in the world. For the first 2 years after Eleanor's death, Charles had functioned primarily on autopilot. He had continued to go to his office, had continued to see patients, had continued to perform the basic rituals of living, but there had been no real engagement with any of it. He had been a ghost moving through the world, present in body but absent in every other meaningful way. His children had been concerned. They had tried, in their various ways, to help him. They had invited him to family gatherings, had suggested that he travel, had encouraged him to pursue hobbies or interests that might provide him with some sense of purpose or engagement. But Charles had resisted all of these suggestions. He had felt that to move forward, to engage with life in any meaningful way, would be a betrayal of Eleanor, would be an admission that her death was something that could simply be moved past, that the 47 years they had spent together could be replaced or supplemented by new experiences and new connections. It was his youngest daughter, Sarah, who had finally convinced him to seek professional help. She had been direct about it, had told him that she was worried about him, that she did not think he was coping well with his grief, that she thought he would benefit from speaking with a therapist. Charles had resisted initially. He had believed that therapy was something for people who had experienced trauma, not for people who were simply grieving the natural loss that came with age. But Sarah had persisted, had found a therapist who specialized in grief counseling, had essentially made it clear that she would not accept his refusal. The therapist's name was Dr. Margaret Chen, and she was a woman in her early 60s who had a particular gift for asking questions that seemed to cut through the defensive structures that Charles had constructed around his grief. In their first session, she had asked him what Eleanor would have wanted for him if their positions had been reversed, if he had been the one to die and she had been the one left behind. Charles had not been able to answer the question immediately, but over the course of several sessions, the answer had become clear. Eleanor would not have wanted him to spend the remainder of his life in a state of suspended animation. Eleanor had been a woman who had believed in living fully, in engaging with the world, in finding joy wherever it could be found. It had taken Charles nearly 3 years to reach a point where he could accept this truth. But gradually, over the course of his work with Dr. Chen, he had begun to understand that honoring Eleanor's memory did not require him to stop living. It required him to live in a way that was consistent with the values that they had shared, that was consistent with the kind of person Eleanor had been. And Eleanor had been someone who believed in adventure, in new experiences, in the possibility of growth and change even in the later stages of life. It was Dr. Chen who had suggested the trip to Portugal. She had mentioned it almost casually, had suggested that travel could be a way of breaking out of the patterns that had become established over the past 5 years. That a structured group tour might provide a framework within which Charles could begin to engage with the world again, without feeling overwhelmed by the need to make decisions, or to navigate the logistics of travel on his own. Charles had dismissed the suggestion initially, but it had remained in his mind, had continued to surface in his thoughts over the following weeks. He had discussed it with his children. Sarah had been enthusiastic, had immediately begun researching tour companies and destinations. His twin children, Michael and Jennifer, had been more cautious, had expressed concern about whether their father was truly ready for such an undertaking. But Sarah had persisted, had found a 7-day tour of Portugal that seemed well organized and manageable, had essentially booked it for him as a Christmas gift, had made it clear that she expected him to go. And so Charles had found himself, on a Tuesday morning in late September, sitting in the study of his house in Surrey, preparing to leave for Heathrow Airport. His suitcase was packed upstairs, containing the carefully selected clothing that Sarah had helped him choose. Clothing that was appropriate for the mild weather of Portugal in autumn. Clothing that was comfortable but also respectable, that reflected the kind of person Charles understood himself to be. He had printed out his travel documents. He had confirmed his reservation with the tour company. He had done all of the practical things that needed to be done in order to prepare for a journey. But there was something else happening as well. Something that existed beneath the surface of these practical preparations. There was a kind of trembling in his chest, a sense of stepping off a cliff into an unknown void. For 5 years, he had existed in a state of carefully managed stasis. The routines of his life had been predictable and manageable. He had known what each day would contain, had known how to navigate the particular challenges that came with grief and loss and the slow passage of time. But now he was about to step out of that carefully constructed world and into something unknown, something that he could not control or predict. The drive to Heathrow was uneventful. Charles had hired a car service, had sat in the back seat watching the familiar landscape of Surrey give way to the increasingly urban landscape that surrounded London. He had thought about Eleanor, had wondered what she would have made of this journey, had imagined her sitting beside him, making observations about the people and places they were passing. Eleanor had been good at that, at noticing details, at finding meaning in small things, at engaging with the world with a kind of open curiosity that Charles had always admired but had never quite managed to fully emulate. The airport was crowded in the way that airports always are, filled with people moving in various directions, each of them engaged in their own journey, their own narrative. Charles made his way through the familiar rituals of checking in, of passing through security, of finding his gate. He had traveled before, had done this many times over the course of his life. But it felt different now, felt weighted with significance in a way that travel had not felt for many years. The flight to Lisbon was approximately 3 hours. Charles sat by the window, watched the landscape of England give way to the water of the English Channel, watched as the continent emerged below him. He had been to Portugal once before, many years ago, when he and Eleanor had taken a holiday there in the early years of their marriage. He remembered very little about that trip, remembered only fragments: the warmth of the sun, the taste of wine, the feeling of Eleanor's hand in his as they walked through some street in Lisbon. He wondered if he would recognize any of it, if the passage of time had changed the place significantly, if it would feel familiar or entirely foreign. The landing was smooth. The airport in Lisbon was modern and efficient, and Charles found himself moving through it with a kind of automaticity, following the signs, joining the queue for customs, retrieving his luggage. He had been instructed to meet his tour group in the lobby of a hotel near the airport, a hotel where they would spend the first night before beginning their journey through the country the following morning. The hotel lobby was filled with people of various ages, most of them appearing to be in their 60s or 70s or 80s. Charles recognized immediately that he was part of a particular demographic, people who had reached the stage of life where they had the time and the financial resources to travel, but who also had the particular vulnerabilities that came with age, the need for structure and support, and the comfort of traveling with a group, rather than navigating the world independently. He checked in at the front desk, was given a room key, and made his way upstairs. The room was small but comfortable, with a window that overlooked the street below. Charles sat on the edge of the bed and felt the weight of the day settle over him. He was exhausted in a way that went beyond the simple physical fatigue of travel. He was exhausted by the effort of stepping out of the familiar patterns of his life, by the vulnerability of being in a new place, by the awareness that he was beginning something that he did not fully understand. He lay back on the bed and closed his eyes. And for the first time in 5 years, Charles Blackwell felt something that might have been the beginning of curiosity about what came next. The breakfast room of the hotel was filled with the kind of gentle chaos that comes when a group of older travelers attempts to coordinate themselves around a buffet. Charles had woken early, had showered and dressed with more care than he had taken with his appearance in years, had made his way downstairs to find approximately 15 people of various ages gathered around tables laden with pastries and fruit and coffee. The tour guide, a woman named Sophie, who appeared to be in her mid-50s, was moving between tables with a clipboard and an expression of cheerful determination, attempting to ensure that everyone had what they needed and that the group would be ready to depart at the scheduled time. Charles had collected a cup of coffee and a croissant and had seated himself at a table near the window. He had been observing the other members of the tour group with the kind of detached curiosity that comes from being among strangers. There was a couple from Manchester who appeared to be in their early 80s, and who seemed to be on their 10th or 15th tour together, moving with the ease of people who had learned to navigate travel as a team. There was a woman from Edinburgh who was traveling alone and who had the particular kind of determined cheerfulness that suggested she had made a deliberate choice to engage with life, despite whatever circumstances had brought her to this point. There were several other individuals whose stories Charles had not yet learned, people who were scattered around the room in various states of engagement with their breakfast and with each other. It was at approximately 8:15 in the morning that Constance Palmer walked into the breakfast room. Charles did not notice her immediately. He was focused on his coffee, was thinking about the day ahead, was attempting to prepare himself mentally for the experience of spending the day with a group of strangers. But something in the quality of the air seemed to shift. It was not a dramatic shift, not the kind of thing that would have been noticeable to anyone who was not paying very close attention. It was simply a subtle alteration in the atmosphere, a kind of gentle disturbance that suggested that something had changed. When Charles looked up, he saw her standing near the buffet table, surveying the options with an expression of amused interest. She was a woman of approximately 70 years old, with silver hair that had been cut in a style that was both elegant and practical, that suggested someone who did not spend excessive time worrying about her appearance, but who also understood the importance of presenting oneself with a certain level of care. She was wearing a lightweight linen jacket over a simple cotton shirt, clothing that suggested someone who had traveled extensively and who understood the importance of comfort over fashion. But it was her face that captured Charles's attention, not because it was conventionally beautiful, though it was, but because it contained within it an expression of genuine curiosity and engagement with the world, an expression that suggested someone who was genuinely interested in the experience of living. She selected a croissant and a cup of tea, and then she turned and began to scan the room for a place to sit. It was at this moment that her eyes met Charles's. There was a pause, not a long one, perhaps only a second or two, but a pause that seemed to contain within it a kind of recognition, though Charles could not have articulated what it was that was being recognized. She smiled, a small smile that was both warm and slightly uncertain, and then she began to move in his direction. "Is this seat taken?" she asked, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. Her voice was warm and carried the accent of someone who had grown up in the south of England, though there was something in her intonation that suggested she had spent considerable time elsewhere, that her accent had been modified by years of travel and exposure to different ways of speaking. "Please," Charles said, gesturing to the chair. "I would be grateful for the company." She settled herself into the seat with a kind of practiced ease that suggested someone who was comfortable in her own body, who had not yet developed the particular self-consciousness that sometimes came with age. She introduced herself as Constance Palmer, and she extended her hand across the table. Charles took it, was struck by the warmth of her grip, by the fact that her hand was neither fragile nor overly firm, but rather conveyed a kind of quiet strength. "Charles Blackwell," he said. "It's a pleasure to meet you." "Likewise," Constance said, and then she took a bite of her croissant and looked out the window at the Lisbon street below. "Quite a view, isn't it? I was worried when I booked this tour that it might be too structured, too organized. But there's something rather nice about having someone else handle all the logistics, don't you think?" Charles had not considered this perspective before. He had been focused primarily on his anxiety about the trip, on his uncertainty about whether he was doing the right thing by stepping out of the familiar patterns of his life. But Constance's observation seemed to reframe the entire experience. There was something liberating about the idea of surrendering control, of allowing someone else to make the decisions, of simply showing up and allowing the experience to unfold. "I hadn't thought of it that way," Charles said. "But you're quite right. There is something rather appealing about that." "I've been traveling alone for the past 3 years," Constance continued. "Ever since my divorce was finalized. My ex-husband and I had been married for 42 years, and we spent most of that time not really traveling anywhere. We were always too busy, too committed to our routines. And then one day I woke up and realized that I had spent 4 decades of my life doing things that I didn't particularly want to do, and that if I didn't start doing the things I actually wanted to do, I would probably die without ever having done them." There was something in the way that Constance said this that suggested she was not looking for sympathy or validation. She was simply stating a fact, was sharing an observation about her own life in the way that people sometimes do when they have reached a certain age and have decided that there is no longer any point in pretending to be anything other than what they actually are. "That's quite a realization," Charles said. "I imagine it must have been difficult." "It was," Constance said. "But it was also rather liberating. My son thought I was having some kind of breakdown. He kept suggesting that I should see a therapist, that I should take medication, that I should move to a retirement community where I could be around people my own age. But what I actually needed was to get out into the world and do things that I had always wanted to do but had never quite managed to do." Charles found himself telling her about Eleanor, about the 5 years that had passed since her death, about the fact that he had been living in a kind of suspended state, going through the motions of living without actually feeling alive. He told her about Dr. Chen, about the suggestion that he take a trip, about the particular anxiety that had accompanied the decision to actually do it. Constance listened with the kind of attention that suggested she was genuinely interested in what he was saying, that she was not simply waiting for her turn to speak. When he had finished, she set down her cup of tea and looked at him directly. "I think you're very brave," she said. "It takes courage to step out of the familiar, to allow yourself to be vulnerable in a new environment. Most people don't do it. Most people spend their entire lives in the same patterns, the same routines, the same relationships. And then one day they die, and they realize that they never actually lived." There was something in the way that Constance said this that seemed to cut through all of Charles's defenses, that seemed to speak directly to something that he had been feeling but had not been able to articulate. He felt a kind of shift happening inside him, a kind of opening up to the possibility that this trip might actually be meaningful, that stepping out of his familiar patterns might actually lead somewhere worth going. Sophie appeared at their table at approximately 8:45, clipboard in hand, reminding everyone that the bus would be departing at 9 o'clock sharp. The group began to gather their things, to make their way toward the lobby. Charles found himself walking alongside Constance, found that they had naturally fallen into step with each other, that there was no awkwardness in their proximity, that it felt entirely natural to be moving through the world beside her. The bus was a comfortable coach with large windows and comfortable seats. Sophie had assigned seats to various members of the group, a decision that Charles initially found somewhat irritating, as it seemed to remove the possibility of choice. But when he discovered that he had been assigned to sit beside Constance, he found himself grateful for Sophie's intervention. The drive from Lisbon into the surrounding countryside took approximately an hour. Constance spent much of the journey pointing out details that Charles might otherwise have missed: the particular quality of the light, the way that the landscape seemed to shift and change as they moved away from the city, the small villages that they passed through, each one containing its own particular character and history. She seemed to have a gift for noticing things, for finding meaning and interest in details that might have seemed insignificant to someone who was not paying close attention. "I've been to Portugal 3 times before," Constance said at one point. "And each time I come, I notice something new. That's what I love about travel. It's never the same twice. The place changes, or you change, or both of you change together. But there's always something new to discover." They arrived at their first destination, a small town in the hills outside Lisbon, at approximately 11 o'clock. The group disembarked from the bus and began to follow Sophie through the narrow streets of the town. The buildings were painted in shades of yellow and blue and white, and the streets seemed to wind in directions that did not quite make logical sense, seemed to lead to unexpected squares and hidden courtyards. Charles found himself walking beside Constance, found that they had naturally fallen into a rhythm together, that they seemed to move at the same pace, that they seemed to notice the same things. At one point, they came to a small square that contained a fountain and several benches. Sophie announced that they would have 30 minutes to explore on their own before reconvening for lunch. Most of the group dispersed in various directions, eager to explore the town. But Charles and Constance found themselves drawn to the fountain, found themselves sitting on one of the benches, found themselves looking out at the square in companionable silence. "Thank you," Charles said after several minutes. "For what?" Constance asked. "For being kind to me this morning. for engaging with me. I was feeling rather anxious about this trip, rather uncertain about whether I had made the right decision. But something about our conversation has made me feel as if perhaps I did make the right decision after all. Constance turned to look at him, and there was something in her expression that suggested she understood exactly what he meant. That she had experienced similar moments of doubt and uncertainty. That she understood the particular vulnerability that came with stepping out of the familiar and into the unknown. "I think we're going to be friends," she said. "I have a feeling about these things, and my feelings are usually right." Charles did not know how to respond to this statement. He had not been thinking in terms of friendship. He had been thinking in terms of survival, in terms of simply getting through the week without falling apart. But the idea of friendship, of genuine connection with another person, seemed to open up a possibility that he had not considered before, seemed to suggest that this trip might actually lead somewhere meaningful. They sat together in the square for the remainder of the 30 minutes, watching the other members of the tour group move through the streets of the town, watching the light shift and change as the sun moved across the sky. And Charles found himself feeling something that he had not felt in 5 years, a sense of possibility, a sense that the future might contain within it something worth living for, a sense that perhaps, just perhaps, Eleanor had been right all along when she had told him not to spend the rest of his life grieving. The second day of the tour began in the town of Sintra, a place that seemed to exist outside of ordinary time, where the mountains rose dramatically from the landscape, and where ancient palaces perched on hillsides like monuments to human ambition and artistic vision. Charles and Constance had naturally gravitated toward each other during the bus ride from Lisbon, had taken seats beside each other without any formal arrangement, had fallen into a rhythm of conversation that felt entirely natural and unforced. They had talked about their children, about their careers, about the particular texture of their lives before the events that had brought them to this moment. Constance had told him about her marriage to a man named Richard, about the way that they had built a life together that had been comfortable, but ultimately hollow, about the realization that had come to her at 67 years old, that she had spent the better part of her adult life doing things that she did not want to do, living in ways that did not reflect her actual values or desires. She had told him about the divorce, about the way that her son had initially been angry with her for leaving, about the gradual process of rebuilding their relationship once he had come to understand that her decision to leave had not been a rejection of him, but rather an assertion of her own right to live authentically. Charles had found himself sharing things with Constance that he had not shared with anyone else, not even with Dr. Chen. He had told her about the particular quality of his grief, about the way that it had transformed over the 5 years since Eleanor's death, about the way that it had gradually shifted from acute pain to a kind of chronic ache that had become so familiar that it had almost ceased to register as pain at all. He had told her about his fear that he had wasted the years since Eleanor's death, that he had allowed himself to become trapped in patterns of behavior that no longer served any purpose, that he had essentially been waiting to die rather than learning to live. The tour of the palaces in Sintra had been conducted by Sophie, who had provided detailed historical information about the various structures and the people who had built them. But Charles had found that he was only half listening to Sophie's commentary. He had been more interested in observing Constance, in noticing the way that she moved through the world, in paying attention to the particular quality of her engagement with her surroundings. She had a gift for noticing details, the way that light fell through a window, the particular color of a tile, the expression on the face of another tourist. She seemed to experience the world with a kind of heightened awareness, as if she was determined not to miss anything, as if she understood that the time remaining to her was finite and precious. At one point, while the rest of the group was gathered in a courtyard listening to Sophie's explanation of the architectural significance of a particular structure, Charles and Constance had found themselves slightly separated from the others, standing in a small alcove that overlooked the surrounding landscape. The view was extraordinary, mountains and valleys stretching out in all directions, the light golden and soft in the late afternoon. Constance had stood very still, had simply looked out at the landscape without speaking. Charles had stood beside her, had also remained silent, had understood that there were some moments that did not require words, that the simple act of being present with another person was sufficient. "This is what I wanted," Constance had said finally, her voice soft and almost to herself. "This is what I was looking for when I left Richard. Not necessarily this specific place, but this feeling. This sense of being alive, of being present in the moment, of experiencing beauty without having to explain it or justify it to anyone else." Charles had not responded immediately. He had simply continued to look out at the landscape, had felt something shifting inside him, had understood that Constance was describing something that he had been searching for, without quite knowing what it was that he was searching for. The third day of the tour had taken them to the Douro Valley, a region known for its wine production, and for the terraced vineyards that covered the hillsides in intricate patterns. The bus ride to the valley had taken several hours, and Charles and Constance had spent much of the journey in conversation, but also in comfortable silence, had developed the kind of ease that comes when two people have decided that they do not need to fill every moment with words. Constance had told him about her travels, about the various places she had visited in the 3 years since her divorce had been finalized. She had been to Thailand and Vietnam and Cambodia. She had spent time in Peru and Bolivia and Ecuador. She had traveled through Eastern Europe and had spent several months in the Middle East. She had traveled alone, had made her own decisions about where to go and what to do, had experienced a kind of freedom that she had not known was possible. "I was terrified at first," she had said. "The idea of traveling alone at my age seemed reckless, seemed like something that only young people did. But I discovered that there is a particular kind of freedom that comes with age, a freedom that comes from the realization that you no longer have anything to prove to anyone, that you can simply be yourself without worrying about how that self is being perceived." Charles had listened to her stories with a kind of fascination, had found himself imagining what it might be like to move through the world with such freedom, with such openness to experience. He had spent most of his life in a state of careful control, had made decisions based on what seemed practical and sensible and appropriate. But listening to Constance, he had begun to understand that there might be value in a different approach, in allowing oneself to be surprised by life, in opening oneself up to possibilities that could not be predicted or controlled. In the Douro Valley, they had visited a winery, had participated in a tasting, had eaten lunch in a small restaurant that overlooked the terraced vineyards. The wine had been excellent, and the food had been simple, but flavorful. Charles had found himself relaxing in a way that he had not relaxed in years, had found that the combination of good wine and good company and beautiful surroundings had created a kind of contentment that seemed to exist independent of his usual patterns of thought and worry. At one point during lunch, Constance had reached across the table and had placed her hand on top of his. It had been a simple gesture, had lasted only a moment, but it had contained within it a kind of communication that went beyond words. It had suggested a kind of recognition, a kind of acknowledgement that something was happening between them, something that neither of them had anticipated, but that both of them seemed to understand was significant. The 4th and 5th days of the tour had followed a similar pattern. They had visited Porto, had walked through the narrow streets of the Ribeira district, had stood on the Dom Luis Bridge and looked out at the city spread out below them. They had taken a boat ride on the Douro River, had watched the landscape shift and change as they moved through the valley. They had eaten meals together, had visited museums and galleries, had spent hours simply talking and listening to each other. But beyond these external activities, something else had been happening. A kind of emotional intimacy had been developing between them, a kind of deepening connection that seemed to grow with each passing day. Charles had found himself thinking about Constance constantly, had found himself looking forward to each moment they would spend together, had found himself experiencing a kind of anticipation that he had not felt in decades. On the evening of the 4th day, they had found themselves alone on the terrace of the hotel, looking out at the city lights of Porto spread out below them. The rest of the group had retired to their rooms, or had gone out to explore the city on their own. Charles and Constance had remained on the terrace, had sat in comfortable silence for a long time, "I need to tell you something," Constance had said finally. "I need to tell you that I think I'm falling in love with you." The words had hung in the air between them, had seemed to contain within them a kind of weight and significance that went beyond their simple, literal meaning. Charles had felt his heart rate increase, had felt a kind of panic and a kind of joy simultaneously, had understood that he was standing at a threshold, that whatever he said in response to Constance's declaration would set the trajectory for what came next. "I think I'm falling in love with you too," he had said finally. "I didn't expect it. I didn't think it was possible. But it's happening." Constance had taken his hand then, had held it gently, had not said anything else. They had simply sat together in the darkness, watching the lights of the city, understanding that something fundamental had shifted, that they had moved from the territory of friendship into something else entirely, something that neither of them had anticipated, but that both of them seemed to understand, was real and significant and worth paying attention to. The 5th day had been marked by a kind of heightened awareness of each other, a kind of intensity that came from the knowledge that the tour was coming to an end, that in 2 days they would return to London, that they would have to figure out what this connection meant in the context of their ordinary lives. They had visited a small village in the hills, had walked through narrow streets, had stopped at a cafe and had ordered coffee and pastries. They had talked about their fears, about their uncertainty regarding what would happen when the tour ended, about the possibility that what they were experiencing might not survive the transition back to ordinary life. "I don't want this to end," Constance had said at one point. "I don't want to go back to my flat in London and have this become just a memory, just something that happened on a trip." "Neither do I," Charles had said, "but I also don't want to rush into something that we're not ready for. I want to take time to understand what this is, to allow it to develop naturally." They had not made any concrete plans. They had simply agreed that they would continue to see each other after the tour ended, that they would take things slowly, that they would allow the connection between them to develop at its own pace. But there had been an understanding between them, a kind of unspoken agreement that this was not the end of their story, that this was only the beginning. The 6th day of the tour arrived with a kind of bittersweet quality, a sense that something precious was drawing to a close, that the bubble of this particular experience was about to burst, and that Charles and Constance would have to return to the ordinary world and figure out what their connection meant in that context. The day had been planned as a leisurely one, a visit to a small coastal town, a walk along the beach, a final dinner with the entire tour group. But for Charles and Constance, it had taken on a different quality, had become marked by a kind of urgency, a sense that they needed to extract every possible moment of meaning from the time that remained to them. They had woken early and had gone for a walk through the streets of Porto before the rest of the group had awakened. The city had been quiet in the early morning light, had seemed to belong entirely to them, had seemed to exist in a kind of suspended state that was separate from ordinary time. They had walked along the riverfront, had stopped at a cafe and had ordered coffee and pastries, had sat at a small table, and had watched the city gradually come to life as the morning progressed. Charles had found himself studying Constance's face in the morning light, had found himself noticing details that he had not noticed before, the particular way that her eyes crinkled when she smiled, the way that her hair caught the light, the expression of contentment that seemed to settle over her features when she was simply present in a moment without trying to do anything or achieve anything. He had felt a kind of ache in his chest, a kind of awareness that this moment was temporary, that in a matter of hours they would be on a bus heading back to Lisbon, that in a matter of days they would be back in London, that the intensity of this experience would gradually fade and be replaced by the ordinary texture of daily life. "I'm terrified," Constance had said at one point, setting down her coffee cup and looking directly at Charles. "I'm terrified that when we get back to London, this will all seem like a dream, that we'll discover that what we experienced here was only possible because we were removed from ordinary life, that it won't survive the transition back to reality." Charles had reached across the table and had taken her hand. The gesture had become familiar over the course of the past few days, had become a kind of language between them, a way of communicating things that could not be expressed in words. "I'm terrified too," he had said. "But I also think that what we have is real. I think that it's real precisely because we're 70 years old, because we've lived enough to know the difference between infatuation and genuine connection, because we've both experienced enough loss to understand the value of what we've found." They had spent the day moving through the coastal town in a kind of daze, had visited the beach, had walked along the sand, had sat and watched the waves. They had not talked much. There had been a kind of understanding between them that words were no longer necessary, that the simple act of being present with each other was sufficient. The rest of the tour group had moved around them, had engaged in the activities that Sophie had planned, but Charles and Constance had existed in their own bubble, had seemed to move at a different pace, had seemed to be experiencing the world through a different lens. At one point, they had found themselves alone on a stretch of beach that was separated from the main tourist area. The sun had been beginning to set, had been casting long shadows across the sand. Constance had stopped walking and had turned to face Charles. She had reached up and had placed her hand on his face, had looked at him with an expression that contained within it a kind of intensity and vulnerability that seemed to strip away all of the protective layers that they had both constructed over the course of their lives. "I love you," she had said. "I know it's fast, I know it's probably not sensible, but I love you. And I need you to know that." Charles had felt tears beginning to form in his eyes, had understood that he was experiencing a moment that would stay with him for the rest of his life, that this was one of those rare moments that seemed to contain within it the entire meaning of human existence. He had pulled her close to him, had held her, had felt the warmth of her body against his, had understood that this was what he had been searching for. This was what Eleanor had been trying to tell him when she had told him not to spend the rest of his life grieving. "I love you too," he had said. "I love you in a way that I didn't think was possible at this stage of my life. I love you in a way that makes me understand that I'm still capable of growth and change and transformation." They had stood together on the beach as the sun had set, had watched the light fade from the sky, had felt the temperature drop as evening had approached. And in that moment, Charles had felt something shift inside him, had felt the weight that he had been carrying for 5 years finally beginning to lift, had felt the possibility of a different kind of future beginning to emerge. The final dinner with the tour group had taken place at a restaurant overlooking the coast. Sophie had arranged for a special menu, had given a toast to the group, had expressed her hope that everyone had enjoyed the tour and that they would recommend wandering years to their friends and family. The other members of the group had shared their experiences, had talked about the places they had visited, had exchanged contact information, and made vague promises to stay in touch. Charles and Constance had sat beside each other, had participated in the conversation when it seemed appropriate, but had remained largely focused on each other, had communicated through glances and small gestures, had seemed to exist in a kind of parallel universe that was separate from the ordinary social interaction that was taking place around them. The 7th and final day of the tour had arrived with a sense of finality. The group had gathered for breakfast one last time, had packed their belongings, had boarded the bus for the drive back to Lisbon. The journey had taken several hours, and Charles and Constance had sat beside each other, had held hands, had not spoken much, had simply been present with each other as the landscape had shifted and changed outside the windows. At the airport in Lisbon, as the group had begun to disperse, as people had said their goodbyes and had headed toward their various gates, Charles and Constance had found themselves standing together in the departure hall, had understood that they were about to be separated, that they would be on different flights back to London, that the intensity of the past 7 days was about to be replaced by the ordinary texture of daily life. "This isn't the end," Constance had said. "I won't let it be the end. I don't care how difficult it is. I don't care how uncertain the future is. I'm not going to let you disappear from my life." Charles had pulled her close to him, had held her in a way that seemed to communicate everything that he was feeling, everything that he could not quite find words to express. He had understood that he was standing at a threshold, that the choice he made in this moment would determine the trajectory of the remainder of his life. And he had understood that there was only one choice that made sense, only one choice that was consistent with the person he wanted to be. "I'm not going anywhere," he had said. "I'm going to spend the rest of my life figuring out how to love you properly, how to build something real with you, how to make sure that what we found here doesn't disappear when we return to ordinary life." The flights had been delayed, had given them an extra hour together. They had sat in a cafe in the airport, had ordered coffee that they had not drunk, had simply held hands and had looked at each other, had understood that they were experiencing something that transcended the ordinary categories of human experience, that they were experiencing a kind of love that seemed to exist outside of time, that seemed to contain within it all of the accumulated wisdom and experience of 70 years of living. When the time had finally come to part, when Charles had had to make his way to his gate, and Constance had had to make her way to hers, they had embraced one final time. Charles had felt the warmth of her body against his, had breathed in the scent of her hair, had understood that this was the person he wanted to spend the remainder of his life with, that Eleanor had been right all along when she had told him not to spend his remaining years grieving, that life was still capable of offering him moments of genuine connection and authentic love. The flight back to London had felt surreal. Charles had sat in his seat and had looked out the window at the landscape below, had thought about the past 7 days, had understood that his life had fundamentally changed, that he was no longer the same person who had boarded a flight to Lisbon a week earlier. He had felt Eleanor's presence in a way that he had not felt it in 5 years, had understood that she would have approved of what was happening, that she would have been happy for him. When the plane had landed at Heathrow, Charles had turned on his phone and had found a message from Constance. It had been simple and direct. "I'm already missing you, but I'm not afraid anymore. I know this is real. I know this is going to work. I love you." Charles had sat in the airport terminal and had read the message over and over again, had felt tears beginning to form in his eyes, had understood that he was experiencing a kind of happiness that he had not thought was possible at his age, that he had been given a second chance at love, that the universe had somehow conspired to bring him and Constance together at exactly the moment when they both needed to find each other. He had typed out a response. "I love you too. I'm going to call you as soon as I get home. I want to start planning our next adventure. I want to spend the rest of my life discovering new places with you, discovering new versions of ourselves together." The drive back to his house in Surrey had felt different than the drive to the airport a week earlier. Charles had felt a sense of purpose that had been absent from his life for 5 years. He had understood that the grief that had characterized the past 5 years had not been wasted, that it had been necessary, that it had prepared him for this moment, that it had taught him things about loss and love and the fragility of human connection that he could not have learned any other way. When he had arrived home, when he had stepped through the door of the house that had seemed so empty and so full of absence just a week earlier, Charles had felt something shift. The house no longer felt like a tomb, no longer felt like a monument to loss. It felt like a place where new possibilities might be built, where a new chapter of his life might begin. He had called Constance immediately. She had answered on the second ring, had told him that she had been waiting for his call, that she had not been able to focus on anything else since she had arrived home, that she had been thinking about him constantly. They had talked for hours, had made plans to see each other the following day, had begun the process of figuring out what their relationship would look like in the context of ordinary life. And as Charles had sat in his study, the same study where he had spent so much of the past 5 years in a state of suspended grief, he had understood that his life had fundamentally changed, that he had been given a second chance at love, that it was never too late to begin again, that the heart never truly ages, that it remains capable of growth and transformation, and the kind of deep connection that seemed to transcend the simple passage of time. Eleanor would have been happy for him. And somehow, in a way that he could not quite explain, Charles could feel her presence, could feel her approval, could feel her blessing as he stepped forward into this new chapter of his life with Constance Palmer, a woman who had taught him that it was possible to fall in love again at 70, that the heart never truly ages. That proof of this truth was written in every moment they spent together. Charles Blackwell had spent 5 years believing that his life was behind him, that the best moments had already passed. But standing in his study, holding his phone, reading Constance's words of love, he understood something profound. The heart never ages. It never stops wanting to feel, to connect, to love. And sometimes when you're brave enough to step into the unknown, when you're willing to let go of the past and embrace the possibility of the future, life rewards you with something extraordinary. Charles and Constance's story is proof that it's never too late to begin again, that love at 70 can be just as intense, just as transformative, just as real as love at any other age. And that, perhaps, is the most beautiful truth of all.